I got a knife today. Look, look, look. I have a knife now. Like a proper knife. Look how cool this fucking knife is. Anyway, my knife aside, I wanted to talk about a topic I see recur online, like every now and then, like every year or so. There's just the same topic that's constantly going on, right? Which is someone on Twitter or something will be like, "Oh, once we get communism, what's your dream job?" or something along those lines, right? And then you have like 20 people in the replies, or maybe more than 20 people in the replies, all being like, "Oh yeah, my dream job is to be a teacher. My dream job is to be an artist. Oh, I would like to be a community manager," right? And no one goes like, "Oh yeah, I'd like to work on a farm or in a factory or do any like more menial or low value jobs or whatever the fuck you want to call it." Everyone wants to do a job that's perceived as important, right? And that's perceived as not being like below them in the sense of like not being like lower class or anything like that, right? And right wingers rightfully make fun of this, right? They go like, look at all of these deluded communists. They think that when communism is gonna happen, right, they're gonna be in these positions, right? Oh, they're completely ignoring the fact that the majority of the population has to do jobs that these people would consider to be beneath them, right? Because they want to have all these fancy, important jobs, when in reality, most of what needs doing is not very fancy, not very important. There have to be plumbers, electricians, farmers, factory workers, garbage men, and so on and so on and so on. Now, of course, me personally, I'm a work abolitionist in principle, right? I think work is not inherently noble. I don't think work is something that has to be pursued, and my ideal society would be one without work as a concept. Dotesmite, what do you mean by work abolitionism? Do you mean that no one should ever work? No, that's not what it means. Okay, so this is a problem I have. I'm gonna go into fucking detail because a lot of people misunderstand work abolitionism. So I'm gonna fucking take a quick tangent and explain why the abolition of work is not such a silly idea as it might seem to be, right? There is a meaningful distinction between work and productive labor, right? And you can do productive labor without having to work, right? Because productive labor isn't something that people want to avoid. Most people naturally, through their hobbies, their interests, their proclivities, their desire to help other people, gravitate towards productive labor, right? If most people sees a glaring flaw somewhere, they would like to be able to solve it, right? Most people are pro doing labor, right? Work is a social system of production, right? Work is a system in which people have to dedicate a capitalist notion of time in order to achieve a meaningful reward for their labor, right? And in in so-called state capitalist systems and various anarchist systems, um, work is replicated within a socialist system of production, right? And that leads to fucking that leads to all of the same problems that work has in capitalist societies, although greatly mitigated, which I'm going to talk about later. Anyway, the point of it all is that the system of work in itself is insidious, right? It isn't just confined to the realm of productive labor, but rather it restructures a person's entire life, right? Even when you're taking a break, you're doing it within the framework of working, right? If your life is structured around work, is necessarily going to be structured around this specific means of exchanging time for productive labor. And whenever you're spending time for yourself, it's still going to be in the framework of time itself being productive labor, right? And work as a system thus becomes a coercive system of control, which is why I think it should be abolished, even though I'm not necessarily against productive labor being compensated, and I'm not against a form of work existing if it's in a really if people relate to it in a incredibly critical way, and if people control their relationship to work. Like, for example, I don't have a problem with going to work. What I have a problem with is the idea that I should give my best hours in a day to work, right? What I have a problem with is I shouldn't wake up 8 hours before my fucking work starts and then give work my 8 hours in the evening where I'm less capable than I would be in the morning, right? Like that's the thing I have a problem with. Fuck, I got some hair in my fucking mouth. Anyway, that tangent aside, let's get back to our original point, right? Which is that work under capitalism, right, is not just an insidious system of social control, but rather it's a system of punitive measures against the lower class. Okay, what do you mean by this? Well, there are certain privileges that come with having money, right? There's a priority that you have once you cross a certain income threshold, and this depends on what you're trying to achieve, right? For example, when it comes to housing, right? When it comes to having an apartment, in order to have an apartment, you can't just have an income, right? In the US, you have to have a credit score, you have to make a down payment, you have to not have been evicted in a specific time frame, you have to have all of these specific checks, right? And the poorer you are, the more likely it is that you can't meet any of these specific checks. Maybe you lost a job and you didn't have any savings, so you got evicted. So now you have that on your record, and people won't rent an apartment to you. Maybe your credit score is poor because you grew up in a poor family and you didn't learn how to manage credit cards early on, and now your credit score is ruined, so no one will rent an apartment to you. Maybe you're literally working paycheck to paycheck and you just don't have enough money to move. You don't have enough money for the transportation fees. You don't have enough money for a down payment. So you're basically being gate-kept from housing. Now, of course, this can be solved to an extent through mutual aid, through housing programs, through generally challenging these systems that are restrictive in regards to people's happiness and so on and so on. But the less money you have, the less options you have to navigate within the world, right? And when it comes to jobs, menial jobs are not just jobs that require a specific type of labor, right? Menial jobs are jobs that are used as punishment for being poor, right? When you can't afford an education, when you can't afford this, when you can't afford that, right? The only option you have left is to do a menial job, right? And they are not jobs that are as good as any other job, right? Because the class of people doing those jobs are not people who do menial jobs. Those are the people who can't afford to not do a menial job, right? And it means that as long as you're within that class of people, you can be mistreated, right? Like can you go like, oh, why are the working conditions for professors or fucking bankers or fucking CEOs better than the working conditions for teachers or retail workers or factory workers or farmers? And it's because all of those menial categories of people, right, are being punished for having that job, right? They don't need to be treated well because no matter what they do, they won't be able to fight it because they don't have any types of they're so deprioritized in every other field of life that they have no option to reject those jobs, right? They don't have a choice in what they're gonna work. They're always going to work a menial job, right? And if all menial jobs are fundamentally in a cartel of punishment, right? Or in a cartel where it's accepted that they have shitty working conditions and where it's accepted that the people who are working those jobs are working those jobs because they are being punished, you can get away with a social discrimination against menial laborers, right? What's the point of socialism? What's the entire point of communism, right? It's to abolish class distinctions. It's to abolish the distinction between the manager, the employer, or not employer, the employee, right, and the fucking farmer and the industrial worker, right? That's the point of communism. Is that none of these class distinctions should exist. It shouldn't matter what job you have. All of those should be equally respected, and all of those should be equally valued, right? It doesn't matter if you're a teacher or a farmer or a factory worker or a retail worker. Your contribution to society is equally invaluable. Your contribution to society is um, inherently worthy of itself, right? All labor is decent. There's no class structure within the system. So it's not just that, hey, these socialists are pansies who don't want to do menial labor. No, these socialists are people who have correctly identified that in our current society, these menial labor jobs are punishments directed against them, right? These socialists have identified that they don't want to be punished, and they have identified that the way to not be punished within a capitalist society is to strive towards a dream job, right? They are aware of the fact that capitalism, right, tries to psyop you into having these types of dreams, right? Capitalism tries to psyop you into dreaming of a world where you are not punished. It tries to convince you with all of its power that you should strive for a position in society where you don't have to do menial labor, because menial labor is soul crushing. It's not conducive to artistic endeavors. It's not conducive to you living the type of life that you want to live. But that's not unconditional. That's not something that's inherent to menial labor. That's something that's inherent to being constantly mistreated, to being constantly punished at work, to being expected to behave as a servant, and being. I don't like the term alienated from your labor because it doesn't really mean that much, but you're being alienated from your labor, right? And these socialists have seen the framework of, hey, we can have a dream job, right? We can have an escape from these systems of punishment, and they have transcribed that onto a communist system, right? For them, communism isn't a system of abolishing class structure. To them, communism isn't a system of unconditional justice. To them, communism is a means of escape from this capitalist system. To them, communism is a equivalent to becoming bourgeois, right? To them, communism is a process of the bourgeoisification of the proletariat, right? So what do? They start talking about their dream jobs in the context of communism. That doesn't make any sense. There are no dream jobs in a system that isn't capitalist. In a system that isn't capitalist, there are just types of labor that you prefer to do and types of labor that you do not prefer to do. And there is no concept of a dream job or a undignified form of labor. At least in theory, ideally, right? Now, practically, I have to talk about my own perspective, right? Because just critique in itself has no value, right? So do I think that these socialists, these communists, should be like, hey, under a system of communism, I'll do whatever the job the party demands of me. If the party needs factory workers, I will be a factory worker. If the party needs teachers, I will be a teacher. No, this is not the perspective I have, because I am an anarchist, right? I don't think seeing labor as a form of social good is a particularly helpful perspective either, right? Even though I think it's a lot better than the capitalist concept of labor, where labor exists within class relations, and labor exists within systems of reward and punishment, right? I don't think it's ideal to see labor as a system of contribution to your society. So what do I believe in? I believe in work that's completely irrespective of power. I believe that there is no essential category of labor that is necessary. I don't believe that. Yes, of course, you need specialized labor to upkeep civilization. Of course, you need people to do labor they don't want to in order to upkeep civilization, right? But at that point, my perspective would be, do we really need to upkeep civilization if this is our perspective, right? if the continuation of civilization in itself requires a perpetual cycle of people doing labor that is destructive to them, is civilization worth preserving? Oh, Dotesmite, but if there wasn't civilization, you couldn't be trans, you couldn't have a computer, you couldn't do this thing you like, you couldn't do that thing you like. That's fair. That's completely fair. I'm not completely anti-civ either. It's just we have to be critical according to these things, right? And I don't think it's productive to see being trans or having a computer as inherently necessary within the context of anarchism. Because within the context of anarchism, the point is that you're abolishing these systems of social power that currently you need all of these things to mitigate, right? Under a system of anarchism, gender would be a far less important part of my life, right? Because I live in a conservative capitalist society, gender is something that's incredibly urgent to me, and that's an incredibly important problem to solve as fast as possible, right? Hypothetically, if I lived in an anarchist society where there were no discriminatory principles in a society based on gender, gender had been completely abolished, right? All of these things, it would be far less urgent for me to have HRT, right? Like in real life, getting access to these pills took me almost 2 years now. This was postponed by the coronavirus pandemic, right? This was postponed by living in a conservative society that treats transgender people as a lesser class of person and that tries to prevent as many people from becoming transgender as possible, right? And so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. But even though that these barriers exist, the framework of the society makes HRT an urgent thing for me to have. In a society where gender was a less important part of me, the question of whether or not I had tits, whether or not I was more comfortable with myself in these following ways, right, would be only a matter of me relating to myself and me relating to potential sexual partners, right? Which is still an important part of human existence, but it is less important than a whole society that discriminates against you or treats you differently based on your gender presentation, right? And so on and so on and so on. Although, again, this is my perspective as someone who is non-binary. I don't speak for all trans people. If for you, no matter what the social condition you find yourself in, it is as urgent to transition, I respect that, I acknowledge that, and but what I'm saying is, if it is that urgent, there is a solution we can find to it, right? Because civilization should be seen as a conduit to human happiness and human joy, right? Civilization shouldn't be a structure that all humans are necessarily beholden to, right? Civilization should not be a structure that humans have to be subservient to and humans have to perform destructive labor for. Civilization should be a thing that we can move in and out of, right? Civilization should be not a process of civilizing people, but a set of institutions that we can use for our own ends, right? If we want a computer, right? If we want a universal access to computers or a access to computers for those who need such an access, we could decide to engage in civilization insofar as we need that access, right? But we couldn't offload this problem to the wider society. We couldn't engage in a passive form of social control or imperialism where there's someone else who will make our computers for us, right? If we want computers in a system where we are critical of civilization, we have to be ready to make the sacrifice of performing the labor in order to have a computer, right? And it would be perfectly valid to decide that we want to perform less labor to have less benefits of civilization, right? We shouldn't see civilization as a universal progressive good. We should see it as a set of institutions that we can contribute to as much as we want to, and that has these emergent properties that we can take advantage of, right? And maybe it is completely reasonable that the first and biggest priority of a system that is critical of civilization would be to figure out how to provide healthcare, including to trans people, in a way that doesn't require anyone to uh, exert a needless degree of subservience, right? And that could perform a perform a degree of specialization that takes advantage of some people's innate proclivity, or not necessarily innate, but inherent proclivity towards biochemical research, towards practicing medicine, towards patient care, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Because there are always going to be some people who who think that this is more important to them than not, and that is a good thing, and that is a thing that we can take advantage of. But that is not a thing that is necessarily always worth the trade-off, right? So, what's my dream job under communism? None. My dream job under communism depends on what the goods I want to participate in are. If I live in a society that does not have a large industrial cooking complex, right, I would want to make sausages because I want to eat sausages. If I live in a society where computers are really expensive, and there's just a perpetual labor shortage when it comes to people who are extracting resources or scavenging resources or recycling resources for the sake of building computers, although of course for ethical reasons I would not want to extract resources in an unsustainable way as they're being extracted in a capitalist society, but I wouldn't necessarily want to figure out the most sustainable way to extract these resources, because for me ecology is a really important issue, right? And for ethical reasons, I would not participate in a socialist industry if I thought it was killing the planet. But if I lived in a society with that set of problems, I would want to work on making computers as accessible as fast as possible, because that is a thing that is important to me. If I lived in a society without fucking trans healthcare, I would be fucking synthesizing pregnant male urine. Although that is not really a inherently necessary step, right? But you know what I'm getting at. Because want people want these products to exist, right? People want these perks of civilization to exist. And it's not a matter of, to me, of social good. It's not a matter of prolonging civilization or helping the civilized world. To me, it's a matter of my personal desire for joy. For me, it's a matter of my personal proclivity towards specific rewards when it comes to modes of production. And to me, that's fine. And if I lived in a society that had no use for my labor, if I lived in a society where my labor was completely up to me, where there was nothing I felt a lack of, where there was nothing that my friends felt a lack of, what would I do, Dotesmite? I'd be a fucking writer. Of course I'd be a writer. That's the one thing that I can do, and I enjoy doing, and I will always want to do. But that's already not a tenable goal in a capitalist society. In a capitalist society, the tenable goal is to be disabled enough that you don't have to be a writer, right? And that is also a tenable goal within a socialist society, right? But in a socialist society, I would not have the same objections to labor that I do in a capitalist society. And it's completely fine for disabled people, in my opinion, in a socialist society to not work. If work is painful, impossible, and a matter of great suffering to you, you should not be expected to work in a socialist society, right? Well, I personally, if I knew I was going to be treated well at a job, if I knew that I was going to be respected as a person, I would have no problem working. Just objectively. I have never had a problem of when it comes to doing productive labor. If I'm in the countryside and I'm doing productive labor for my family that I feel is important, I've never had a problem with that, really. When it comes to painful fucking field work in the summer, when it comes to collecting wild berries, which involves a lot of bending down, and involves a lot of fucking bullshit I don't want to deal with, I'll fucking want to do it, right? When it comes to doing household chores, for example, most of them are very unimportant to me. I don't prioritize a cleanly household, right? But but these are not things I have necessarily an objection to if I know I'm going to be treated well. If my mom is coming home and if I know that she likes a clean house, I will clean my house. If my mom is really busy with work and can't clean the house herself and can't maintain the standards of cleanliness that is necessary for her to be happy, I will clean the house, right? Because to me, those forms of labor are completely neutral. Those forms of labor to me are forms of labor that I am fine with engaging in. And also, under capitalism too, there are some forms of labor that I have done before because they're worth the rewards, right? I've done accounting work for my parents, right? I've done various data entry for like scientific projects because to me those are things I can do relatively easily, right? And to me those are things that have rewards that are worth the uh, job itself. So this is just like a theory thing that applies to a distant socialist future, right? This is just a way that you can relate to labor within society right now, and the way that you can relate to labor within society in the future if we ever reach a society that can account for everything that is necessarily um, important to me, right? Because the point of anarchism, this is my final statement, this is my final tangent. The point of anarchism isn't to create an anarchist world. It's to create a world where more people are anarchist, right? And anarchism on a personal level isn't a social system necessarily. It's not a matter of, oh, I'm gonna restructure society. It's a matter of restructuring the way that you relate to society. It's a matter of restructuring the way that you relate to other people. It's a matter of restructuring the way that you relate to the world, that you can, to a certain degree, free yourself from these systems of power that do not benefit you, right? And ideally, we would abolish all systems of power because that would benefit the most people. But until that point, we can take steps to examine how we relate to the world, and we can take steps to apply these principles to our practical lives, and so on 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 and so on. Anyway, that's all my thoughts about these fucking clusters of issues. And I have a knife. It's cool. Communist smite out.